Three, two, one. It is very uncomfortable to think that you'd probably get lung cancer if you smoke for 10 years. But the thing is, when you have it, you start to think about this. And you start to think why you got it. This is exactly what crisis is about. Crisis is a unique opportunity for people to actually care about things and care about preventing things in the future and how society needs to change often radically in order to prevent these things. Note, before I go into our points, I want to explain what this debate is not about. This debate is not about us saying that we shouldn't put out the wildfires or that we should not admit people in hospitals and give them first aid or help the homeless, etc., if they're on the street. It means that it's about social narrative and what kind of pressure we put and what kind of rethinking we have in our society due to this. Note, as a few points of framing. First of all, we often it is quite clear what caused a crisis, but it's very uncomfortable for people to think about it, especially when societal change is necessary. Secondly, we think that the trade-off in this debate is probably that we might fix the current crisis slower, but we think the net outcome over a long time is much better because if we have a social narrative about preventing, about changing society in a way that could prevent further crisis, we are actually able to prevent them in the future. Then, secondly, we think that crisis is a unique point in time where people have an imperative to act because people cared. At this moment, the crisis is the most important topic. They care about the media, what the emotional response they have to the pictures, etc. And even if they're not directly affected by it, they do by the direct consequences, people think about how it might affect them. Note that people often prioritize current topics in the way that they think about it. It has an extremely big impact on their surrounding and also on their voting preferences, etc. So we think that this is a unique point in time where you're able to get to changes that you otherwise would not get in the long run, and that it's otherwise very, very hard to get these societal changes. We also think that societal narratives shape extremely how you think about a crisis and what you think others should, how others should respond in a crisis. Before I go on, I will take CO.
Is transformative change always for the better?
We think that transformative change is better than doing nothing because at least one, you try to do something. Secondly, if this is what the societal narrative is, you pressure people in power, you pressure your surrounding in actually thinking about what this change should be, meaning that the discussion shifts to a much better point than just trying to fix it at the moment, but to what actually the root and the causes and how we should change it. So yes, I do think it is for the better. Then, to our first point, why societal narrative matters and how it shapes how people think. We think that it shapes like what a narrative is and what a societal narrative is. It means that it shapes how what people think and what they think is reasonable to expect. If the narrative around restoration is around restoration, what people also expect is that this crisis gets fixed, and once it's fixed, they can move on. It also portrays people who point at the cause and say what needs to be transformed in a radical way as unreasonable or radical, meaning that the opportunity on your side of the house to actually reach any change is much less likely because they are outside of that norm. If you fix the crisis to a large extent without actually fixing underlying problems, without actually discussing underlying problems and about and talking about what changes need to happen in society, it means that you actually also condition people that once a next crisis happens, that there is a easy fix, that there is a solution to this crisis, that there is a solution that they can expect, and this is how they need to go on, which means that not only how you fix this crisis is important for this one, but it's also important how people expect a future crisis to be dealt with. I will take OO now.
Yeah, what policies are we speaking about in this regard? Because I'm a bit confused.
Oh, I think it's about, for example, having much more radical environmental policies, banning certain technologies, given that we are in an actual crisis. I think it's forcing politicians or having a social narrative around, for example, when a pandemic, a virological pandemic hits, that you should not weigh off economic the economic benefits of like very big companies against the health of people, but that you need to fundamentally change on how you prioritize these things in your society, and that this is not a trade-off that is easily made. I think these are all things that we're talking about. If not, Mira can clarify later. So how does this transform what people expect and how people also interact, and how we engage with future crises and the current crisis? We think that based on what people expect and what social narrative is, we also form responses with what we expect, and this shapes political choice and pressure. We think that politicians in the status quo have incentives to go a path that satisfies their constituency and lobbying the most, and what they cannot control is if they're being voted out, meaning even the biggest friend of big companies or big oil companies cannot control whether people vote them out in a democracy or not, which means that if the social narrative is around restoration, etc., it's much easier for them to shape it so that they are still liked and that they're still friends with their companies, because they do not have to actually make radical changes on how this works. On our side of the house, if the social narrative is one that pressures them, it acts in much better interest of people and society as a whole, because often this radical change is something that preserves life in the future, because if you actually close the borders, or if you actually go into quarantine, etc., earlier than later, because you don't weigh it off against your economic lobbies, it means that you save lives in the future. But secondly, it also transforms the discussion about restoration to looking into causes and how to prevent it in the future much more, because it is now expected, because the societal narrative is around it. If media pinpoints and says, oh, we have all these floods in Germany that we didn't have for years, we want to know what caused it. We don't just want reparations for the houses that just happened, we want to know why it's happening. It means that also there's a response wanted from people in power and from people that make decisions about how we change society, because we are at this unique point in a crisis, and because it is also the only point where we can have this transformation. Please vote OG.
I thank that speaker for that very fine speech, and I'd like to invite the leader of the opposition to begin the case their side. Here.
Wonderful. Am I audible?
Yep.
Great. I'll prefer my POIs in the chat, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel: society changes and transforms every moment that we are making policies, every time that we are implementing new regulations. We think that change in society is something that is not necessarily unique to crisis, but the way in which we talk about this crisis and the way in which we talk about this change is something that does matter in this debate. As such, we think it is unlikely that policies under side government are going to be radically different from the policies that we get. Rather, we say the way in which it is talked about these policies is something that's more clear. Given that we did not get a whole lot of definitions from the side of government, let me first give you an example of how we think that this is something that is going to look like, so the debate becomes a bit more clear. At the moment that we were talking, for example, about the banking crisis in 2008, we think that what was happening then, or what a way of transformative policy was then, is saying, well, we radically need to change the way in which our banking system works, make sure that less people can access loans, because that is something that is different. The way in which we frame it under our side of the house is we need to make sure that we fix the banking system, and we need to make sure that we can go back to making sure that everyone benefits from the banking system, because that is how it was before the crisis. This is a different way of framing, which can both result in a different interest rate on banks in a similar manner to affect that kind of change, but it is about the way in which you are framing that, not the exact thing that you are doing. As such, the burden in this debate is where we do get the most compliance with the kind of policies and are able to make sure that we do get the best change possible. And we are going to argue that that is happening through restorative change in and of itself. We are going to do that in a couple of ways. First, I'm going to go into the issue, what we got from the PM speech, and saying, well, people start thinking about the crisis when it happens and are going to reflect on how it's caused. Because I'm going to argue for you that it's the case that people don't think that they have caused a problem and thus are unlikely to want to sacrifice something for that problem because they don't think that they are to blame. The difference here with the cancer example that we get in the PM speech is that it is likely that cancer is something that is not a collective action problem that you have caused yourself when you are smoking, but the crisis we are facing in society are a collective action problem. Then I'll argue how that is also dealing with more compliance and why people are ultimately going to feel that they are helped. A lot of this is directly engaging with what the PM has brought. All right. So how do you think at the moment that the crisis is happening? Because we do agree that at the moment that something like COVID hits or the 28 financial crisis hits, you want to know how that is happening. However, there are a couple of reasons as to why we are going to reflect it on specific institutions rather than how we as general people in society function. Why is that the case? We say that given all the actions that we are having on the short term, you are benefiting from a lot of the behavior that has caused a crisis, and that is something that makes you likely not to want to give that behavior up because that benefit is very direct. However, the harm and the risk that you are getting from this is something that might happen in the long term. You are reflecting this on specific kind of institutions rather, because we see like the idea behind this is in general that we know that the way in which we have had markets in China, for example, before COVID could cause problems for epidemics. We knew that the banking system or the housing market wasn't functioning well in 2008, yet we haven't responded to those warnings beforehand. And the reason we're not doing that is because of the fact that we benefit from the actions that we are doing in the short term, i.e. we know that having trade with China is something that can be problematic when it comes down to an epidemiological problem. We don't necessarily see that then also means that it is problematic that we buy a Chinese phone or a Chinese car or a pen made in China, for example. We don't make that link as people in society, given the fact that it is something we benefit from and that we cannot solve ourselves. Because if I would stop buying pens from China, that is no guarantee that Franca does or Marina or anyone else. And that means that I don't feel like I have the burden for that change and just that there is a collective action problem. So the way in which we are going to reflect on this problem and the assumption that the case from government then relies upon is not going to happen because people are not going to reflect on themselves, but are rather going to have the feeling that this crisis has happened to them because institutions didn't function well, but that was not something they individually could have done something about. That means that they are going to feel that now at the moment that we are going to make transformative change and that we are going to say, well, this didn't function well, we need to radically change the society, people are going to feel like you have taken away something from them because they now need to pay for the faults that are being made by other people and by other institutions that you cannot help about. Why is this so problematic? Because that means that people are going to be less inclined to agree with the kind of transformative situation that you put up for them because they have had benefits from that in the short term. This can result in a couple of ways that decrease the compliance of specific policies. One, people are going to feel that it is their fault, even though they don't agree with that, but they feel that the government puts blame on them, which means that they are on an individual level less likely to follow the policies because they don't want to change their life for something they didn't do wrong, but others did wrong. This can result in very simple things, such as not wearing face masks that are still very detrimental to the overall solution of the crisis in the short term. We think that the crisis in the short term is also very important because it's a guarantee that these policies can make a change, at least to a certain extent, on that crisis, whereas we never know, given that future crises are reliant on a lot of different risks and different situations that people don't that future crises aren't going to exist. So they can still exist. So we think that these short-term crises are more important and that we need to make sure that people do comply with that, right? Even at the moment that these transformative policies are good, which we think they could be. Secondly, then we say that it is also likely that people don't want to give up kind of ideas to others as well, specifically talking about employers, for example, who might not want to make people work from home or want to make that as difficult as possible because they are afraid that their entire business model needs to change because now the society is going to be transformative. Again, this means that policies are just not going to follow, but it also makes it harder to implement policies at all. We say that this is something that is also problematic because at the moment, if you cannot implement policies, chaos is going to arise of how is it going to be the case that these crises actually have occurred. We think that that is something that's problematic because we cannot do anything then to either change the short-term crisis or to make changes on the long run. That is something that is very problematic. Panel, I think that ultimately, both on the short term as the long term, we need the framing of restorative policies to make sure that we get any change possible at all. Last but not least, I want to note that I didn't take a POI because no one offered me one. That being said, I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for that very fine speech, and that is indeed a reminder to offer and take POIs. Cool. I now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case their side. They're here.
Can someone please confirm that I'm audible?
Yep.
Thank you. Panel, any crisis I can think of that I have experienced during my lifetime has a few things in common. Whether we talk about climate change and all of the disasters that we are seeing around us, whether we are talking about the refugee crisis or we are talking about Corona or the banking crisis in a way, it was very clear that there are problems that need to be addressed, whether it is to stop meddling in the Middle East and stop giving guns to bad people just because we want to sell arms and stop invading countries, or whether it is, to invest the money in pandemic preparedness because all of the experts are telling us that they are very likely to occur and that we're going to be screwed and not able to stop them once they do hit. I think they all have in common that it's a bitter pill to swallow, i.e. we don't want to spend the money to do that. We don't want to take the personal sacrifice to no longer take the flight to some cute island on vacation, meaning that governments don't have an incentive to do that unless they have to. Notice that when opening opposition concedes that there are going to be future crises, and they also concede that people don't want to do that because they benefit from the things that put us in crisis in the first place, then they also concede that on their side of the house, the path forward, once you think beyond this current crisis, is to more crises that are probably going to escalate. And they don't give you any solution on how, once you have fixed this crisis, why you are then going to be able to fix the problems that put you in a crisis in the first place, thus preventing the next crisis. So even if opposition is somehow able to prove to you, though they haven't so far, by the way, but even if they're able to prove to you that in the short term, there is less harm being done on their side of the house, they still need to deal with the fact that they are putting themselves on a path for much more harm long term, partly directly caused by the policies that we are choosing when dealing with the current crisis, right? But also, if opposition's problem is that they fear people are going to feel that it's not their fault, so they're going to revolt against the government and not follow regulations, just think about how this gets worse with every new crisis that happens. With every new crisis, the government doesn't take the radical change necessary to stop and to prevent in the future. And with every new crisis, the government looks more and more incompetent, and more people feel vindicated in thinking that the government doesn't know shit anyway. Who cares if I follow what they say or not? Here's what Marina tells you, and there's no response from OL. When you are deep in a crisis, people care about fixing that, and people care about fixing what brought them there. They rebut Marina's example on cancer by saying, ooh, we don't talk about cancer, but they completely ignored that Marina used that as an illustration for the logic of what gets us in these problems in the first place. It's useful to do in the short term, as OL concedes, and we prefer instant gratification over preventing catastrophic long-term consequences. When people panic, they tend to forget the forest because they focus on one tree. The problem is, once you put out that burning tree, probably the rest of the forest is also on fire. Notice that the debate doesn't stop when you've put out that one tree. You have to deal with how do you put out the rest of the forest as well. Opening government gives you a path for that. Opening opposition does not. What Marina also tells you is that in panic, people are willing to change. People have an imperative to fix things and they want to fix things now, right? So when OO tells you that society transforms every moment, like sure, to some extent, but clearly we go down the same path, right? We do more of the same. We want to grow more of the same and push forward. Sometimes we need to take a few steps back and maybe degrow our economy so we can stop fucking our climate, or maybe we just need to take a turn. The problem is you don't get those under normal circumstances. You only get them on our side. Opening opposition somehow tries to make this comparative on, oh, instead of radically changing banking, so banks are no longer allowed to gamble with subprime mortgages and other things that are clearly very bad, but rather we should make sure everyone benefits from the banking system and has access to loans. I'm not sure why opening opposition seems to think that giving people loans they cannot repay and sending them into bankruptcy is a good thing. It's clearly not, and it's partly what caused the 08 crisis, right? So I genuinely don't think opening a position has explained to you why restoration is good. Here's the thing about restoration. Restoration usually means reverting to whatever was before the crisis. So when you revert to whatever it is that brought you in the problem in the first place, that is probably not the best policy to pursue. Let's look at why transformative change is most likely going to be very good. One, because when we are in a crisis, so notice that this debate isn't about, oh, the inflation was 3% instead of 2% this year. This has to be an actual massive crisis that actually influences the whole of society, so that we have a social narrative that actually everyone cares about how we get out of this crisis and how we deal with it, right? So it's very clear what the problems are usually, mostly because these crises have been decades in the making, right? But also too, there's very, very high accountability because all eyes are on the governments responding to them. It's literally what you see in the news every day. It's what you see in your Facebook newsfeed when you open your phone. It's what you talk about with your friends. It's what you talk about when you go to the restaurant. It's what you have to consider when you go on vacation, all of these things. But also thirdly, it's the highest concentration of expertise that you are ever going to get. When a crisis hit in 2008, when the corona pandemic hit, everyone who had something to contribute dropped whatever they were doing to contribute to the crisis. You are never going to be in a better position to address this crisis with expertise than you are at the moment when the crisis hit and people are focused on fixing it. But also fourthly, notice that if CEO wants to run with, oh, but governments can abuse it, because see Hungary and Poland, notice that one, abuse is symmetric on both sides of the house, meaning that in a crisis, when governments can pass extraordinary measures, they can do it regardless of what the narrative about transformation is. However, the benefit that you get on side government is that when what you focus on is transforming society for the long term, then governments that want to use this in order to oppress people don't get away with saying this is temporary. They don't get away with passing atrocious laws by lying to their people that it's just for a month or two. Yes, opening.
When my house is on fire, what I want is to put the fire out. Not
Yes, okay,
thinking,
thank you. Look,
maybe my bedroom is also on fire.
Clearly, this is not about helping the ill or sheltering the homeless or providing relief, right? Clearly, you can do on both sides of the house because we are talking about recovery on both sides of the house, right? The problem is, do you rebuild a house that was flooded next to the same seashore that is likely to be flooded next year with the same central heating system that is coal fueled? Or do you rebuild it in an area that is safer with green energy somewhere where it's actually more likely to lead to less problems in the future, right? It's, do we put out every forest fire that ever happens whenever there's a spark in the summer, which is going to keep happening? Or do we realize that letting dried leaves and broken branches build up just means that if we build them up over 10 years, because we put out every tiny forest fire, the forest fire that happens in 10 years is going to be so big that we can't stop it. If we focus on stabilization, we're going to get the quick path of least resistance. We might stop the house from burning, but we cause more damage in the long run, and we've squandered our opportunity to fix the problems that got us in the crisis in the first place. Op doesn't have a path to fix it. OG necessarily wins.
I thank that speaker for that very fine speech. I'd now like to invite the Deputy of the Opposition to close the top half. Here.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Great. Three, two, one. Panel, I think the CA team put the word narrative in this motion for a reason. So in my speech, I'm going to do two things. First, with a short rebuttal, I'm going to explain why I think that the policies are likely to be the same on either side the house, and what is the way that we frame them to the people and what mindset we have them. The reason why I think that all those policies are the same is because policies stand and fall by the ability of other people to comply to those kind of policies, and I think that that compliance doesn't particularly change. Then I'm going to actually explain why people are likely to not comply with it, other than merely just claiming, oh, this is the best time for them to do it, without giving any reason why that is going to be the case. Then I'm going to say why compliance is the most important part in this regard, and otherwise the harm is indeed comparatively larger. Cool. Let's first do a couple of rebuttals. Look, when Mary says, oh, but if there's a forest fire, that's the moment where we are able to start thinking maybe there's a forest fire somewhere else too, is the moment where A, she doesn't explain why that is true, and C, she doesn't, I think that is just false. The moment where there's a fire in my room, I'm panicking and thinking I need to put this fucking fire out, otherwise I'm gonna burn alive. I'm not gonna think maybe it's better also there's a fire. I don't know. Let's speak about it. The same thing goes, by the way, for the whole point of smoking, where they are so keen on. Look, Lindsay doesn't say, oh, it just doesn't work about smoking. The key difference here is that smoking in this regard is an individual thing where I know I'm blamed for the fact that I smoked and therefore have lung cancer. The moment where it's a collective action, I always will feel the harms of the damage that collective action done harder, because that is something I personally experienced, overthinking that maybe the fact that there is a problem, I do not really contribute to. Why? Because we know that the climate crisis is happening, and yet everybody thinks it's not really my fault, because no, this is because I don't know, governments fuck up, or because everybody is kind of doing this, because we are humans who are really, really bad at taking blame for the thing that the entirety of society do. Thus, which is why that mindset doesn't work. Cool. The reason why I think it's similar policies is for the following reason. They never defined it, so I can easily walk away with this. The thing with the Middle East, or the for example, and the difference that this debate is going to make is not whether we're going to radically change the Middle East or the crisis that's happening there, or whether we're going to do climate change, or with the flight thing that they say. The difference is that we're going to say we want higher taxation on flights, or say we want more taxation going towards green energy, so that we can keep flying to cool destinations, instead of saying we need to massively stop our overconsumption because that's the problem, and radically change the fact that we're doing that. In the same case, it leads to a policy of higher flight taxes or better redistribution of forms of green energy policy, or new forms of, say, climate change things. The difference, however, is whether we tell that so that you can keep all your benefits, or we say because now we need to change. The trade-off I'm willing to make in this debate is indeed that we don't create a mindset along society of radical change, but I think because that is impossible, it is better to cater towards society and saying you're not to blame and we're going to give you your bad life, while still taking the small steps that is changing, because Lindsay said already that those small steps are continuously happening anyway, and I think that they are the only way. The reason why I think that people do not or are incapable of having a mindset of compliance is as follows. The first part is that we just don't think we contribute to that action as much, as Lindsay already explained. But the second part is because I feel scared, or I feel victimized by the thing that's happening around me, because it is so big. The moment where the economic crisis happened and all the banks fell over and I lost my house is a moment where I go, oh no, that is something that everybody did because governments weren't able to restrict banks, not because I have been a tiny part of a huge, large system that is entirely fucked up in society, and therefore I do also have to, I don't know, pay higher loans or pay higher taxes in order to solve this crisis. I am more willing to think that I am the one who therefore needs to be scared or needs to be safe. The second thing is because I'm already fatigued, I don't really want to think about the fact that this crisis could go even any longer, or want even more uncertainty. There is already so much uncertainty. And a transformed society means that there's even going to be more uncertainty, because nobody really knows what that society is going to look like. The third reason is because people have short thinking. People want to have something to the solution, and they're paying right now. The moment where a government proposes a policy in a narrative that says it's all going to radically change, I'm unsure whether I can frame that in the back of my head into actually functioning of solving the problems that I'm facing right now. Whether I am losing my house and I pay to struggle my rent, a radical change society isn't really for me able to frame. This is why I now will be able to pay my rent in the future, whereas a solving thing of restriction is, even though the policy around that is the same, which means that I'm much more likely to comply with these kind of things. Why do I then think that the framing of going back, even under the same policy, is so important? One, because the worst thing in a pandemic is not that people don't exactly do the most radical thing they can do, but that they don't comply with a certain thing at all. Look at, for example, the inability to wear face masks of a lot of people, because they don't understand why they have to do all the radical things that they do, because they don't see how it links back to the thing or the pandemic that is currently happening. If you do this in a narrative of radical change, you're not focusing on, say, solving what's the problem at hand, which is why so many people are working together in the current pandemic, because I think that makes them able to go back to their previous life. It makes them unable to envision why they should listen to the government in the first place. That's the moment where you get people protesting the government in all forms that they can. That's the moment where people no longer want to wear face masks, even though it is even unrelated to any form of other form of, say, transformative policy, because they just lost faith in the government overall. The second thing is that when people lose faith in the government overall or in compliance, they no longer support their political parties. That means that their political parties drop out of the government. That means that you have governments dissolving and re-elections happening. The worst part in a crisis isn't that you immediately now transform society overall. It is that people don't give in into any form of change whatsoever, which means that nothing happens. The worst part in a crisis is that not necessarily people, or that it's the right change, but that there's no change at all and no functioning government at all. Before I continue, opening government.
As much as you want to claim that any transformation that simply doesn't contain the word radical is on your side, the trade-off is transformation versus restoring to previous status quo. Taxing
No,
flights or
Miri,
green
the
energy is
trade-off.
our side.
No, Miri, thank you, Miri. The trade-off is whether it's a narrative of transformation or a narrative of restoration. I think often similar policies are happening, but the end goal of that policy is framed towards a different direction. You have to defend why this is the unique moment where you can get into people's mindset in order to make them feel some form of blame. We give you 6 mechanisms why people are unable. You just claim that people magically think of forest fires as something that they have contributed to. That is a comparative that you lose. I'm very sorry. The narrative, therefore, why people are able to restore is because that gives them a sense of stability or a sense of something that they're going to get something back or that you're going to help them solve their pain. In the end, those policies are likely going to be the same because policies are often marginal and their outcomes are always uncertain. So the thing that we do can be framed in many ways, but we're probably still going to do the same thing because we think that that is the thing that's going to work or is going to be best in the long term. That's how policy designers make their policies usually. What we prove to you is that probably people are unwilling to comply because they never feel that burden and they're horribly scared and they don't think that you're working for them anymore. The reason that we explain to you that is bad is because the moment where people don't comply, you get a complete dysfunctionality in society in that crisis, which means that even the smallest policies are not longer going to work, even if they don't have a direct link, whether it's restoration or any form of transformation. That means that in the end, you get stuck in that crisis. And during crises, I do think that people die at a higher rate or get lost in a higher rate than they do in a normal situation, which is comparatively worse. I rather lie a bit or frame a bit to people with a similar policy and tell them they're going to get everything back, or even change my policies in such a way that it's a bit less transformative and a bit more restorative, the moment where that means that less people die from getting that crisis in a similar stage and where more people are willing to work with it and therefore solve society as a whole, I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
Speaker for that very fine speech, and I'd like to invite the member of government in the back half. Here.
I'm so sorry for my timing, by the way, but the timekeeper seemed really confused with my timing as well.
Yeah, I think it's okay. Anyway,
Am I audible?
yes.
Okay, great. Then I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. One point to the things that we've just heard from opening opposition that I want to touch upon real quick, which is the point of like this: people don't want change because they don't want to feel like they have a responsibility. We think that it is actually good if they don't really feel a responsibility, because what we want them to do is not to just look at which responsibility do they have, but we also want them to look at which responsibilities does the system have and how can we change the system to create substantial and sustainable change, because those are the things where sustainable change actually happens. Okay, what will we bring to you in our extension? So the things that we want to talk about is what do these narratives look like, and what we most importantly want to talk about is why those narratives are going to be things that most people can agree upon, and why those things are bound to be good things more often than not. Okay, so let's dive into these points really quickly. So why do we think that the changes that will happen are actually going to be good? Well, first of all, because crises have this, have this trait that they expose actual harms in our systems and draw a lot of attention to them. We've already heard that from OG to a certain extent. So for example, when we look at the climate crisis and resulting natural disasters, we see that our economic system isn't working. We see that the way that we currently organize our society around capitalism does not do us any good, because it propels the earth towards extinction of most species. When we look at pandemics and economic crisis, it shows us that our currently social systems kind of enable people to fall into the trap of poverty really quickly. It kind of shows us that the way that we distribute healthcare is very unequal and that we live in a very unegalitarian society. All of those things are very concrete harms that we think most people can agree upon are actual harms. Okay, so transformative changes need a substantial amount of people to carry those changes with them, right? So if I want to overhaul the system, if I need a certain amount of broad public support, especially after a crisis where a lot of people kind of feel insecure, you want those changes to be changes that most people feel hopeful about, that most people can get behind, which is why we don't think that people, for example, could superimpose bad changes onto people, even with a transformative narrative, because the transformative narrative needs to be one that a lot of people can get behind. Otherwise, it will be very hard to implement. So what are those changes that we are talking about here? So we think that currently that we think that if we envision this idea of having many grand narratives, of having transformative narratives, we think that people have very different opinions about what those things should look like, right? So we have, I don't know, people who want a Marxist feminist utopia. We probably have people who want a second, third Reich. We have people who basically want a capitalist utopia. So the question that we're going to have to ask us here is which of these narratives will actually dominate? And we think that the things that will dominate are the things that most people can get behind, because the most attractive narrative is going to rally most public support, which means that politicians will feel, like kind of compelled to put these into practice, or will feel justified in doing so because those people have the most political capital at the moment. So which of these narratives generate most support? We believe that the narratives that benefit most people are going to be the ones that can do that. So what are those things that most people can get behind here? So we think that, for example, most people can get behind the idea of having to work less. Most people can get behind the idea of having a clean planet and not having climate change doom our entire existence. We think that most people can get behind ideas of a more egalitarian society, and we think that a lot of people can get behind the idea of having better social safety nets. So why do we think that those changes can rally most public support? Because there are things that usually are going to affect me on a personal level, right? Because they trigger my own survival instincts. So for example, things like I wonder about what if the climate crisis hits and I don't have access to clean water anymore? Or I think that, like maybe if I lose my job, then I fall through the public safety net and I won't have access to food anymore or to education anymore. Or what if a new war breaks out, then there's something that will actually cost me my entire existence. So we think that those things are something that affect me on a deeply personal level. So this is something that I'm bound to care about. Yes, I'm going to take, who was last? Let's go with OO actually.
People don't think logically in a crisis. That's an assumption. It would benefit most people no longer fly to far destinations, yet we do because we feel blamed when people tell us that we don't. Can you please give a good reason why they will?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so your point is that most people don't act rational in a crisis, which is exactly where those grand narratives fit in, right? Because those narratives are kind of bound on emotions, because they're bound on dreams. I'm actually going to get to that on my next slide, but I just want to continue the point real quick why most people will agree on those narratives, because they affect me on a deeply personal level, because they trigger my own survival instinct, and because I'm kind of bound to support narratives that want to create a more egalitarian society, because most people have a vested interest in not being discriminated and not being excluded, and we think that generally most people aren't assholes and could get behind those narratives. So why do we need these transformative narratives in order to actually combat this point of lacking rationality in points of crisis? Because as OO has correctly mentioned, during times of crisis we may feel hopeless and we may act irrational, and this is exactly where those grand narratives come in, right? Because they give us something to work forward to, because they give us an idea of what the world could look like. Because humans usually rely on great visions and on greater ideas that are disseminated among a lot of people in order to make those change happen and in order to create the social capital. So the power of things, the power of utopias, is usually creates humans to be capable of great things, even in times of crisis and even in times where I might not act completely rational, which is because those narratives are so, so chock full of emotion, because it is very emotional to think about a world where people wouldn't live in poverty. It is very emotional to think about a world where the climate crisis wouldn't be a problem affecting all of us. And we believe that what these narratives do is that they give people a way to overcome this feeling of hopelessness that they might have during a crisis, because they give us the idea that the world could actually be better. They give us the idea that we could maybe actually make lemonade out of lemons, and they give us the idea that we actually can do something in order to prevent further crisis, instead of just reverting to the system that has just brought us into this fucked up position in the first place, right? So when do people actually manage to create meaningful change? When we have a common vision and goal, and we've just explained to you why those things are usually going to be good things, and when I have the feeling of it being possible to actually achieve those goals, and when I see an urgency for change. And this is a situation that is very much given in a crisis when we use grand narratives to view it as a point for change and for creating urgent change. Very proud to propose.
I thank that speaker for a very fine speech, and I'd like to invite the member of opposition to continue the case their side. Here.
Cool. Okay, just give me 1 minute to get all of my many sheets together. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, closing opposition's pathway to winning is very simple in this debate. What I'm going to do is I'm going to firstly do some meta debating, explain exactly why most of the assumptions that teams in this debate have had about what the debate is actually about are wrong, probably rebut opening government if I have extraneous rebuttal for them. Then I'm going to explain what this narrative actually looks like, because it is astonishing I have to do this in member of opposition, but it hasn't actually appeared in any speech so far. And then I'm going to explain to you very simply why what we do on closing opposition is very simple. It's very small, but I think we're going to prove it well. And I think it's going to be the most important impact in this debate. I think we're going to make people feel better about being in a crisis. We're going to limit the trauma that they feel. They're probably just going to feel a little bit better about this. And we're going to mitigate the massive trauma that happens as a result of crises. Okay. Firstly, just on what we want in this debate, rebutting some of the stuff from opening government, explaining why it doesn't really matter about change. Look, I think that the most important thing in this debate is individuals, their quality of life and how they feel. I think this is the assumption that every single team in this debate has had so far, because you only really want transformative change in order to help people, right? Like the only reason that you want to have the kind of Marxist utopia that CG are talking about is because you think it would be better for people. Logically, it follows then that the most important impact in this debate is what can improve the lives of other people. I think that the change, like, firstly, this debate is just not about change. It's a narrative debate. I think that both government teams are already out of this debate at the point at which they say change happens, but they don't explain why this narrative specifically leads to change, what it looks like, how people respond to it, etc. But moreover, there are like multiple reasons I can think of why change is just incredibly unlikely. Even more, we're going to take a higher burden than our opening opposition and say that, look, we agree with them that if change does happen, it's probably going to be similar, but here are also reasons why it probably won't happen at all. Look, collective action problems mean that people are incredibly unlikely to actually get together, solve the differences. People have ideological differences about how to do this. I hate to break it to CG, but right-wing people exist as well as left-wing people. There's probably going to be a lot of arguing about how to respond to this, how to have this change, how to make it happen if it's actually transformative, because note that you have to stand over on government transformative change instead of just being like, oh, we're going to like lower taxes by a percentage point. Money is incredibly difficult to overhaul a whole system. Most countries are already massively in debt because of when crises happen, because crises are expensive. Different priorities to their electorate. It's a global system, so it's incredibly difficult to actually resolve. Look, I think that's why change doesn't happen. Also, transformative change in crises is often really bad. Look at pretty much every crisis that has ever happened and how it's been abused. I'd like to note that when OG respond to this, they say the governments will abuse this anyway. It just means that you can't say it's temporary, which means that they conceive that change and how it actually happens is not connected to this narrative, which means that they have literally no delta in this debate because they've just completely mitigated anything they could have said. Okay, cool. In terms of what this narrative looks like then, I think that what this narrative looks like is the idea that we will have hope again. It's all the things about when the COVID-19 pandemic happened and people say we will hug again. One day we will be able to do all of the things that we used to do before. We will restore the specific order of society that you are desperately missing now that you are all trapped inside. I think that the way this happens and the mechanisms by which it's disseminated range from things like government rhetoric, the PSAs that people wear about like wearing masks, so you can go back to like, I don't know, playing football with your friends. It looks like how newspapers respond to crises. It looks like how the media frames specific government responses. It looks like community and how people talk to each other, because note that the motion specifies is not a policy motion. It's just that this narrative should be present in society. I think the point at which it is present, it's reasonable for us to assume that it is how people talk to each other. I think this looks like the fact that people say, oh, we will be able to go out and do all of these things that we miss again. Or if it's like a war, people will be like, oh, one day this war will be over and things will be like how it was before when we all really liked this. I'm going to explain why people like that, but I think that's what it looks like. I think then moving on to the specific substantive here. Okay, two main points in this about what a crisis is and how people respond to it. I think that a crisis is really bad. I think this has not been contested, so I'm not going to explain why it is bad, but I'm going to explain how people respond to it. I think it's incredibly traumatizing. I think even if it is something as small as, well, okay, if it's something that you are like, say if you're like a massively privileged person who lives in like a mansion in Beverly Hills, you're still probably going to be pretty traumatized by COVID, even if nobody that you know dies, because everything that you thought you knew about the world has been upended. It is a period of massive upheaval and strife. It is a period where you are desperately worried. The average person is desperately worried that everybody that they care about may die. If it's something like, I don't know, a climate crisis, there's massive flooding in Germany, and you've seen people that you love die, you've seen your home destroyed, that is massively traumatizing for you. And often note that crises are incredibly prolonged. This trauma lasts for like months after months, years if it is a COVID-19 pandemic. What this means specifically is that people are probably less able to engage with their jobs. They're probably less able to earn money. They can't work the overtime that they used to because they don't have the emotional bandwidth to do so. Note, and also crucially, it means that people don't have the emotional bandwidth anyway to care about all this change that government wants to happen, because they are so focused on surviving day to day. Probably they've lost money as a result of this. Probably they're incredibly stressed about finances. They're probably fighting with people at home because of this. They are in an incredibly stressful environment. They don't have time to care about it. What they specifically need is things like hope, is things like a cohesive narrative that means that they can bring together with the community in which they live because of a support, and that gives them a support system that can support them through this trauma and help them move on. Before I explain about people, I'll take opening.
What we also tell you in OG is that if even during the worst of a crisis, you assure people restoration is the way, they're even less likely to accept any change. And with every new crisis, the government looks even more incompetent. How do you ever fix
Okay, you don't explain about incompetency. Change is not an inherent good. Also, change is just not, as I've already explained, really going to happen. If it does, it's going to be symmetric. It also doesn't matter what the change looks like. It matters how people respond to a specific narrative and which is better for people, because your assumption is that people deserve to have good things and we are giving them good things on closing opposition. Look, I think that people have massive status quo bias. I think that even if you are somebody for whom the status quo was not actually that good, at the point at which you go into a situation that is demonstrably worse, maybe you're suddenly like not earning as much because your boss can't pay you. You're on like unemployment because you've been fired from your restaurant job because restaurants aren't open anymore. I think comparatively, your minimum wage job previously looks pretty good. And as the average person, because note that the average person is not some kind of Marxist radical like government want you to believe. The average person probably reads a tabloid. It's probably pretty susceptible to things like populism. It's probably not all that fussed about being radical. They're probably a moderate, which means that they just want to go back to the life that comparatively seemed better for them. What this means is that when you push forward that narrative, you do things like you give them hope. You limit the trauma that they are feeling, because you are no longer actively traumatizing them at every moment by saying, look, our new world is going to be really different to the one that you liked before. You're never going to go back to the one that you liked. I think what that does is it's just worse for people. It makes them more traumatized, and it means that they don't respond to this change better. For all of those reasons, vote closing opposition.
I thank that speaker for that very fine speech. I'd now like to invite the government whip to close the case for their side. Hear, hear.
Okay, I'm audible.
Yep.
That's great. Cool. Few eyes in the chat. Wait, let me open it for a second. Okay, and then I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. First, let's quickly deal with like CO. Their response to us is that you have collective action problems, but and they tell you that like people can't agree on change, but they just assert that and never say why. And Mira actually gives you structural analysis why this is true. Mira tells you that some things people can agree on. We think that not all people are either super leftist or super Trumpist. CO also says that. But we say that conservative people also kind of want to stop climate change because they still want to help their farmers, and they still want their farmers to be able to make agriculture and stuff. So we think that like they never rebut us, and our point still stands, and they only assert that this will be bad. And they also tell us that like that like in a crisis you need hope. That's actually what we give you. Mira explains to you that Mira's last minute is actually all about that people need hope, and that people will get hope through this through these transformative narratives. Okay, but why do you get less hope on their side of the fuss? We think that people get extremely disillusioned if everything returns to normal and people don't, and that doesn't mitigate the fact that I know we face systemic problems, but now I have nothing to enable me to envision a way out of this. This is extremely bad and means you feel powerless and extremely disillusioned, means you will feel even shittier about a crisis and face greater psychological harms out of this. This directly clashes with CO, and this is why we win this clash on like disillusionment and stress. We further think that like on our side, you still get some sort of change. As Mira has explained to you, that we get some positive change. Because Mira's extension is all about that that you need to feel hopeful, that these narratives will be good. This is what she uniquely brings you. She tells you why good changes occur, and we also tell you that on the other side, these good changes won't occur that much. This now also directly clashes with OO, because they tell you that like that you get that change is symmetrical on both sides of the house, and that this is all about compliance. We think that even if this is the case, you get less compliance on their side actually, because like this is not rebuttal, because as they also point out in their PI, people are not rational, meaning that people also want to have hope and want to have and want to feel that something actually changes. And they saw that their system is shit. They saw a very drastic problem, and if you see a drastic problem, you as a not rationally thinking person, you necessarily need a very drastic solution, meaning that you need to have you need someone to promise you a drastic solution. It doesn't matter what comes out in the end, because like when this change will occur, this will be like in the future time probably, and people don't have like the headspace to remember what they felt like 1 year ago, because they're not rational. But they're much less likely to comply if you only tell them that that you will just a bit tweak the system and get like a bit of change. And therefore, we'll also win on this clash, because they're more likely to comply if you promise them that something will actually be good. Okay, let's further interact with OO a bit. They tell you that I will take you, but let's interact with you for 1 second, okay? Like they tell you that people don't want to comply to these narratives because it means that they would have to change something about themselves. We think that, first of all, Mira told you that the narratives people will agree on and the changes that will agree on is something that that they want. Out of your own analysis, people won't rally behind a narrative that they don't want, a transformative narrative, meaning that these transformative narratives that we get, or these chunks of change that we get out of these transformative narratives, will be something that a majority of people want. And because that's something that a majority of people want, people still want to comply, because even if like some people don't agree on this, they're also still not rational, and people want to fit into society and want to comply. If a majority of society does something, you don't want to stand out. You want to feel included, and you don't want to feel like the outcast. You don't want to be the dick that ruins it for all of them. If people are called out, and people will be called out if a majority of society agrees on some sort of change, people do something. Like the example with climate change that they get doesn't comply, isn't true in this case, because right now we don't already have this huge sort of crisis that people need to act upon. People just don't see it yet. Okay, let's take OO.
So our case, and CO similarly, is that the reason people don't hope is because they feel punished by the measurements, by something that they didn't do, when they think that they have to extend their panic over the long term, in which then CO explains that to us in a similar voice as well.
Okay. I think that, like, Mira told you that there's a plurality of what people want in transformative narratives. People need transformative narratives because they want to feel like they have to look forward to something. That's Mira explained that to you. Okay, so, and I now explained how this relates to your case, that people will only rally behind what they feel like they want to change, meaning that this collective action problem doesn't exist, because by Mira's analysis, there are ideas that are collective to all, like some stuff just affects you on such a basic level, every human being, that you want it. And this is why we win on this clash, because we also explained to you like why this is the case. Okay. Also, let's talk a bit more about opening path. And none of them ever tell you why you actually get good change. And this is also why we take it over our OG. Because Marina explained to you that people want to solve a crisis, yes, but they never necessarily tell you that this change will be good and that this change that people will agree on. We take a much more nuanced stance and explain to you that even if people have different ideas of how this transformative narrative could look like, they will agree on some sort of array of things. We prove the positive changes that OG wants. We tell you why there will be these best narratives. They just give you a few examples how this could happen. We give you structural analysis why this actually does happen. We take the opposition cases at the best and explain why this change will be good. We get the best possible change and we give the people hope. Therefore, proud to propose.
I think that speaker is a very fine speech. I'd now like to invite the op whip to close the debate. Here.
Hi, I just want to double check that I'm still audible before I begin.
Yep.
Fantastic. Okay. I will just put my sheets in order. Okay. I will take POIs in the chat and I will begin in 3, 2, 1. I think Aisling has already won this debate at the point in which she explains the mechanistically how we actually achieve hope on our side of the house. I think in terms of what we get from CG, I have 3 responses. The first is in terms of expectations and how you achieve change. If you are creating a world in which everybody has different expectations as to how your transformation manifests itself, so whether one is more radical in their Marxist approach as opposed to another, and the radical is disappointed as to how this transformation doesn't really meet their beliefs, so they think that the safety net isn't good enough, or the change in how we achieve this progressive agenda isn't sufficient in actually achieving their metric as to what it actually stands for a progressive agenda sufficiently, I think you lose this impact in terms of how you're able to create hope insofar as people all have a distinct understanding of what hope looks like. My understanding of dog is different than the person next to me because my dog could have died yesterday while yours didn't. And when we each have different understandings of what these terms mean, creating different expectations for how this policy manifests means that you are definitely going to have an unsatisfactory opinion as opposed to actually one in which is created on fundamental reality and ability to actually create hope based on things that you have already experienced and a fundamental understanding of what a society can perhaps look like, as opposed to envisioning one which is unequal to everybody else. If you're trying to create utopias, you're just going to end with a dystopia. But secondly, in terms of why creating a restorative fact of change is better than the past and better than one in which you're trying to create a future that doesn't exist. I think in terms of how we actually change for the how we cement our ideas of the future, I think that this was because of the fact that people have some form of nostalgic beliefs. They think that the past was better to some degree. People believe that they are going to have positive memories associated with their youth when they had less responsibilities, less stress and pressures of having to have a job and having to conform to greater societal needs. I think there's also confirmation bias to some degree because you want to believe that even the mistakes you had in the past were to some degree good because otherwise you feel bad about yourself. You want to avoid those bad feelings. You prioritize feeling better, so then you're far more likely to want to focus on the past and restoring that again. But I think fourthly, you have status quo bias because it is familiar to you. Note that the average person doesn't believe that they live in some Marxist hellscape. They believe that they're actually engaging with their lives to a positive degree. And note, I think that this is all unique to what we have provided you in CO. This is nothing to do with OO because we have provided you unique changes, unique beliefs as to how this narrative changes how you feel about the traumatic event that has occurred, as opposed to them, which is consistently contingent on actual policy change. We are talking about how the average person wins. So I think in terms of CG, I've effectively rebutted and taken out their case on weighing. I think we just provided you more realistic change. Oh, and finally, one last point. In terms of the fact that you're trying to get a wide sweeping change, considering the polarization that already exists, considering how crises make people fearful, more into dichotomous thinking, and far more likely to be pushed to the extremes, I am unsure how you get wide sweeping change and more people agreeing as to what this change should look like. I think that instead you get more division, and I think that if you want to create a wide policy that is actually passed, that means that you are going to necessarily have a marginal change and low impact in terms of what policies even put in the first place, which will likely mirror and reflect what was already in the status quo again because of the mechanism, because of the mechanisms actually gives you and the rebuttal I've already provided. On to OO. I think what OO provides you is not sufficient to take it over us in this debate for 5 reasons. The first is because we've provided you distinct impacts that are predicated on the belief that we actually cope with trauma effectively, insofar as we are logically prior to them, because in order to actually have effective policy change, you must first have a coalition of people who believe that this policy change is A, worth going for, B, incentivized to create this policy change, C, that this policy change can be important, and D, willing to actually comply to this. All of this is contingent on their belief to actually be sufficiently happy and motivated to want to engage with this. Insofar as we're the only team to actually deal with a largest scale of the average person who is actually engaging with this traumatic experience, we take them out on scale, on being logically prior, and the ability for them to actually achieve any of their impacts is contingent on first having a group of people that wants to actually engage with the past in the first place. I think that we provide you uniquely all of this for their case to necessarily stand. But secondly, I think that we are not contingent on change actually happening. We never have to prove that change happens. This is a narrative debate. We are just proving the fact that there is a change in how people engage with the traumatic event that happened, insofar as we are able to demonstrate the delta of like what is most likely and the likelihood of this delta actually happening, we take it over them in likelihood analysis. But thirdly, I think they never fully explain why compliance is important. We provide the necessary reasons as to how compliance perhaps may happen on their side of the house. So we outweigh them on that. Before I continue, I'll take a POI from opening so that I can get onto their case.
Look, even you conceded in the first half of your speech that we do need change. Clearly, disagreeing on what to change when everyone is desperate to change something it leads to better change than telling everyone everything's fine, let's go back to the way
change that I conceded to was how people feel about the traumatic events. People shouldn't feel terrible or uncertain about the future or wary as to how they're going to actually cope with things. I think that people are inherently selfish. They want to protect themselves. I think people are unlikely to want to like revolt what they've had in the past. I don't think like you actually get significant change. And I think that the type of change that you get is not the type of change that I was talking about. To be more explicit, I think that the change that we are guaranteed to have on our side of the house and our team exclusively is the ability for people to actually feel better about the traumatic events that have happened. This means that they are far more likely to have access to income because they can do a better job at work. They're far more likely to actually be constructive in their relationships and actually engage with that on a healthy metric, as opposed to being constantly reminded of past traumatic events and not being able to be fully there for their partners. I think that this looks like talking to your kids and actually thinking that there's hope for the future. I think that that's a key change that we provide you. Your change is one of having significant policy reform, which I don't understand why that happens on a narrative debate. Moreover, I think that we outweigh you in terms of our ability to actually demonstrate that perhaps change isn't going to be good. But secondly, you never stand over fully. I mean, you do stand over change consistently being good every single time. Ashling, POI to you on this, you said every type of change is good, but you never actually tell me how we should prioritize this type of change. I think that just because you have expertise in public, perhaps you never show that that's good expertise. I think you have anti-vaxxers like constantly perpetuating these norms and these narratives that are false and actually not true, but people are still engaging with this. They're not good expertise. It's not good quality. People are fearful. People are unable to actually engage positively. And I think that this means that you're not actually fixing the current crisis. As to your long-term impact, I think that we outweigh you on this, because if you're able to actually restore back to the mechanisms that you had previously and give legitimacy to those mechanisms because you're hopeful in them, then you're far more likely to be able to change things in the future using those mechanisms, such as participating in democracy, as opposed to having a revolution like CG wants and not having an actual mechanism for change. For these reasons, I think that you actually get more beneficial change on our side of the house. Thank you.
I thank that speaker for that very fine speech, and indeed everyone for what was an excellent debate. I'd urge you to leave the room, make friends outside the debate, etc. One of us will call you guys back in like 15 to 20 minutes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cool.